first of all, thanks very much for inviting me. I came to EPFL many times, and it's always, a pleasure to be here. So today, I'm a little sick, so bear with me. I'm going to talk about maker education, especially in the context of higher education. And today I was visiting some labs with Jessica and other people, and I got to know a lot about what you were doing here. And so I'll try to adapt, during the questions, some of the stuff I meant to talk about to your particular context. So just as a kind of quick, overview, I always like to, mention my graduate students and postdocs and all of that. So, there they are. Two of them are actually from Switzerland, and they were at EPFL in one way or another. So Burton is now a professor at Harvard, and Engin is finishing his PhD and very willing to come back to Switzerland. So, stay tuned for that. Some of my collaborators at Stanford and at Chiang Mai University in Thailand. And this is just for your information, just about the FabLearn program, which is a program I started at Stanford about 8 years ago. And we mostly work in K-12 education, but if you're interested in that, in kids making and maker spaces for schools, we have, you can go to the website. We have lots of resources. And we do conferences every year. There is a conference in the US, but there's also conferences all around the world that deal with maker education for kids, in Europe, in Asia, and everywhere. And we also publish every 2 years a book about best practices in maker education, especially for kids. So if you're interested in that, have a look. But let me talk a little bit about how I got started in all of this. So, when I was an engineering student back in São Paulo many years ago, I was sort of bored, and I didn't like how engineering was thought, and I thought there was a lot of formulas and a lot of memorization and all of that. And I was, very disappointed, actually. And one day I was like in the library. I was a metallurgical engineering major, and I found this just completely by chance, this paper about, kind of solid state physics and how to do computer simulation of crystals growing, grains growing. And this was, in the 90s. I'm not going to say exactly when because it's going to give away my age, but this was one of the first attempts to kind of simulate materials on computer, in computers and all of that. And one of the things about this paper is that, I was so bored about formulas and all of that. And what they proposed is, let's forget formulas. Let's just use, the power of computation to simulate the individual atoms and find out what they're doing, and just look for, this kind of atomic configurations and do some kind of simulated annealing and find out what's the most stable states of those crystals, instead of, memorizing all the formulas. Just put stuff on a computer and see what happens without any kind of a priori knowledge about, this kind of analytical formulations and all of that. And, if you're curious about that, this ended up being, my so it ended up being my undergraduate thesis, and then you can see crystals growing and all of that. And this computer simulation, to my surprise, gave exactly the same solution as the analytical equivalent. So I don't know if you can see here, the theoretical growth exponent is 0.5, which is almost exactly what you get from all the formulas. So I'm just showing this because I was like completely fascinated by the fact that you can express engineering knowledge in many different ways that's not just formulas. And I realized that the formulas that we have, they're just a function of the representational media that we have. So, because we used to have only paper and pencil and stuff like that, we used for centuries, formulas and kind of stuff that you can write on. But when you started having computers, all of a sudden you can represent the same kind of knowledge in a different medium, and it just so happens that it's a lot easier to do, and it requires a lot less mathematical sophistication, and you can do this with computers. So I'm talking about this, you might have guessed why, because a lot of prototyping used to be like that. So it would be complicated, you had to spend hours and hours in the lab, you have to know all the minutiae of electronics, mechanics, and all of that. And, and all of a sudden we have a bunch of machines that can make a lot of things that used to be extremely complicated, very accessible to lots of new audiences and new students. So this is what made me fall back in love with engineering, and now I think we have a chance to make students fall back in love with engineering, not doing solid state physics, that's a bit kind of, it doesn't sound so exciting, but creating stuff, prototyping, making, and all of that. So, what does maker education means for engineering? And so that's sort of the question that I want to answer today. And to do that, I'll try an analogy. So what does the industrialization of paints and brushes mean for art? So if you know a little bit about art history, in a couple of centuries ago, if you're a painter and you want to paint, you have to go to the woods and get some pigment and some kind of resin from the trees and go find a horse and cut the hairs of the horse and do all this stuff. So half of the work of painting was just making the materials, making the paints and all of that. So, now that we can go to a store and buy for, 10 Swiss francs or euros or whatever, a box of like 10 different colors and all of that, it means that everybody can be an artist in a way, and art can be in more places. So it's that kind of analogy that I want to make in engineering, is that now with maker technologies, everybody can be an engineering, and engineering can be in more places. Of course, there are lots of, things about everybody can be an engineer. It's not that simple. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is that we have a big opportunity to democratize engineering, to make it different than what it is, and to make it available and accessible to lots of new audiences, if we can kind of open our minds a little bit beyond the traditional practices and teaching methods of engineering. Because as I said in the beginning, a lot of the things that we used to use to design engineering solutions, design prototypes and all of that, maker technologies made them so much easier that it can transform how we engage students in that. So let's talk a little bit about how we can do that. So, three things that I think are important in this discussion. One is that it's not just business as usual, so we have to transform our mindset about how we teach students in engineering schools, and I'm going to talk more about that. So it's not just like teaching the exact same content using new media or new technology. It's doing this kind of big transformations that we really teach different kinds of things and in different kinds of ways. The second thing is that we can de-engineer engineering education, because in the sense that we can make it more creative, we can make it less technical, we can make it more diverse. And by diverse I also mean more accepting to different cultures, more gender neutral, more connected to design, to art, to other things. And also we can infuse engineering in other fields. So we can invite people from other fields, from education, from health, from all kinds of agriculture and all of that, bring them into engineering so that they can help engineers design better products and solutions. So, I'm going to talk today about those four things. First, an origin story of what is this whole maker thing, maker education research, teaching and design. So let's start with this origin story of maker education. So how did it come about, and why? What's the whole point of it? So maker education is the result or the maker movement, of 5 trends. One trend is the social acceptance of the ideas of progressive education. So you might have heard about, constructivism. It's, it was sort of invented by a guy in Genève, Jean Piaget, a Swiss guy. I hope you know who Jean Piaget is. But the idea of, Jean Piaget, or constructivist education or progressive education, is that, we should not just teach people, we should engage people in experiences and hands-on learning, in project-based learning that's that's meaningful to them, that's interesting to students, and all of that. And Piaget started talking about this like a long time ago, and many other people, but it was not until like the last 10 or 20 years that people started accepting this as a mainstream kind of thing. So today, if you talk about to a minister of education, maybe, I don't know, maybe even in Switzerland or in other places, like, what's the education of the future? No one will tell you, it should be about memorizing formulas and, just reading books and doing tests and all of that. Everybody will talk about education is for creativity, is for, having new ideas. It's about, students kind of falling in love with learning and all of that. And so that happened just in the last 15, 20 years, and now people call this sort of 21st century skills, right, and all of that. So that's the first trend, is that these ideals, it took 100 years, but they're finally part of the mainstream kind of mindset in education. This, you can, as you know, the former president of the U.S. going to a makerspace, and he actually held the first maker fair in the White House, like I think 4 years ago. And I mean, 20 years ago, you'd never see like a U.S. president, in a makerspace holding a maker fair in the White House, because it was just not part of the, the kind of zeitgeist. And of course, we miss him so much. Anyways. And you have this now encoded, written in national standards, national curricula. So in Canada, for example, the new national standard in British Columbia has a new mandatory course, that Applied Design Skills and Technologies, which is sort of essentially an engineering course for, kids, for like basic education. So this is now mandatory in many countries. In the US, also the Next Generation Science Standards, which is just like a fancy name for the national standards in the US. It says that the students are expected to, define problems, generate solutions, build prototypes. And so the practices of engineering now are part of the national curricula of the US and many other countries. In Europe, many countries have, engineering as part of the national standards. So, that's the origin story of maker education. I'm saying that engineering and prototyping and creating stuff and making stuff used to be just like, after-school robotics programs and stuff like that. Now it's part of the mandatory stuff students have to do in many, many countries. So you have thousands and hundreds of thousands of kids now being exposed to engineering and in a mandatory way. So that's a really that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. The second trend is that every country is looking for the kind of innovation holy grail. So no country is saying, oh yeah, we want to produce more like agriculture stuff, or more coal, or more like iron ore, or no one wants to produce commodities anymore. No one wants to produce all this stuff. Everybody wants to be the next Silicon Valley, the next innovative economy, and all of that. So obviously, people then go and say, what kind of education system we need if we want to be like an innovative country, a 21st century country, and all of that. And people go back to maker education, or students building projects, students creating things, and all of that. So countries are putting money and energy into that. The third trend is, coding and making now are household brands or names. So there's code.org, there's the Hour of Code, there is Scratch, maker fairs all over the world. So those used to be, this kind of tiny things happening here and there in some engineering schools. Now they're big things. The fourth trend is the reduction of cost in digital fabrication technology. So, when I was an engineering student, a 3D printer cost like $200,000. It was like a huge machine that no one had access. It was, like science fiction kind of stuff. Now you can buy a 3D printer for like $200 or euros. So that's a kind of miraculous change that happened just in the last, 10 or 20 years. So 20 years ago, if you tell, someone, oh, a kid can have a 3D printer at home and play with it, or even if you tell someone you can have your own robotics kit and play with it, and it costs like $50, people would be like, you're totally crazy. Like, that's impossible. To do robotics, you need 5 EPFL students for like 2 years working in a lab, and they can build a robot, but no way a kid will be able to build a robot. But now, you can do all of that. And the last trend is that we have much better tools, much better research from academic labs. And so those tools are robust. So think about Scratch, for example, the programming language. It's something that runs on the browser. It requires no installation. It runs on tablets, on phones, or all kinds of things. I mean, if you remember how much work it was to install programs in schools or in computer labs, and it's so much easier now. So all of this it's really miraculous that we're kind of alive in this moment where things that took 50 years, now they're all here together at the same time. So this is kind of the equivalent of having paint that you can buy for like $10. But those are all the materials, the raw materials of engineering that are now available to everyone. And we that are in engineering schools and we know about engineering and we want to democratize engineering, that's a really once in a generation opportunity that we have. So that's sort of the origin story of why we're here and what maker education is and what happened in the last 15 years. So now I'm going to talk about maker education in research, in design, and in teaching. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is research. So one thing that you might think is that, okay, like it's great to have all this stuff happening and let's just put students in a room with machines and they will learn the stuff on their own. But that's going to be a big missed opportunity because, people that work in education research, we know that learning is much more complicated than what it seems. And there's a lot of very interesting opportunities to do research on kids or engineering students learning in a prototyping lab. So let me give you some examples of maker education and research and some kind of counterintuitive things that we found. So, for example, with Bertrand Schneider, who used to be my postdoc, that I showed his picture in the beginning, now he's at Harvard, we did a study where we compared 2 groups of students. One that did experiments first and then read or watched a video of theory, and the other group first watched the video and then did experiments, right? So that's sort of sometimes people call the flipped classroom, that you watch a video at home and then you come to the lab and you do experiments or you do some projects and all of that. And the really interesting result that we got that's counterintuitive in a way is that people who did experiments or explorations first, they learn much more than people who first watched videos and then did experiments. So, you can see the group that did the group that did experiments or exploration first, they scored much higher than the group that first watched the video. So what we found out, and then we did many replications of this study, is that for many disciplines, the idea of flipped classroom is actually counterproductive because you watch the video without any context of what that video is about, without any questions or curiosity about what that stuff is. You just watch this decontextualized video, and then you go to this exploration or this lab, and you think you already know the stuff. So the way you engage with the experiment is very different than doing the experiment first. So we found out that in many situations, it's better to do what we call the flipped classroom. So you first do explorations in the classroom and projects and experiments, and then you watch the videos later. So that was, a counterintuitive result that we got from doing research, experimental research in this case of undergraduate students. And you can read more here in this paper. Another kind of research that we do is by using this kind of biosensors and gesture sensors and looking at, kids actually building stuff. So in this case, we're using a gesture sensor, and you see like it kind of zooms out, and then so it's sort of like this, right? You can get all the kind of joints, and there's some face recognition, but it's basically this idea that you can capture people's gestures, and then when we run this with lots of people, we did a comparison between experts and novices, doing some kind of building task, and we found out some pretty interesting things. So, this is just a kind of wireframe of 24 different people. So, one thing we found is that, as predicted, people that are very passive, they learn less than people that are active. So if you're active with both arms and all of that, you have a better score in the post-test. But the most interesting result in this thing was that the best predictor for learning was not even how active you are, but it was how many times you transition from passive to active. So how many times you stop and then restart, right? And then so we realized that our hypothesis is that this is about students, they perform better when they learn how to stop and reflect on what they're doing and then starting again, instead of just like doing stuff all the time without ever stopping. So, and we also did further studies on this, and it seems that it is the case that students that are more expert builders, they pause more than students who are novices. So when when you're more expert engineer, or when you're better at building, you build some and then you stop, you reflect on what you're doing, and then you decide what's your next step, and then you go. So you pause more, and if you're a novice, you're just kind of doing trial and error all the time and never stopping. So that was another kind of counterintuitive result that we got from doing research with students building stuff that can, of course, inform how you teach in a classroom, right? Because if you see your students just doing stuff and never stopping and never reflecting and all of that, you can, maybe redirect them or change the way you're teaching. We also did a study that was also quite counterintuitive on collaborative learning, also with Burton Schneider. And so basically what we did was, and the papers are always here. So we had, students working on a collaborative task, on two students working together, and we did a kind of we split we did a medium split by GPA. So GPA is the grade point average, just like the average grades that students have. So there's the high GPA student and the low GPA students, you see. And then there is what we call the driver and the passenger. So the driver is the student that kind of takes charge of the activity, and the passenger is the student that kind of is more like observing and all of that. So anyways, so as sort of predicted, the students that when we had both the driver and the passenger, so both students in this diet were kind of high-performing students, they scored very high, right? When they were both low performers, so low GPA, they performed like, as expected, sort of low. When the driver was high, not that the driver was on drugs, but I realized that's not a good. When the driver was a high performer student, and the passenger was low, they performed almost as, as at the same level as the kind of two low performing students. And the most interesting thing was that when the driver was the low performing student and the passenger was the high performing student, they performed almost at the level of this diet here. So the hypothesis here is that, and you might have observed this when you teach, is that when you have students work in pairs, and the most experienced student, either like the guy or the person who knows programming better or knows kind of electronics better or whatever, they kind of take charge of the computer or the soldering, iron or whatever. That person already knows a lot, and the other person doesn't know much, and they don't participate much, right? So the person, the driver is saying, "Oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that," and the other one is like, "Yeah, sure, yeah, okay, I'm following," but he's not really following. So they are, as a group, they're not learning very much, because they're just like the driver is doing what he or she knows. And the other one is kind of pretending to be following, but not that much. But when you invert the roles and the driver, the main person is the low-performing student, the student with less experience, then they have to actually talk and communicate, because the passenger, the high-performing student, has, they have to establish a dialogue and talk, okay, now you should do this and all of that. But it's interesting because this guy cannot actually do this stuff. So this dynamic is much more productive than this kind here. So just another example of a kind of counterintuitive research result that is very applicable in kind of maker spaces or maker environments, because lots of times students are working in pairs or working groups, and lots of times students who know more, they just take charge of stuff, and that's not a great kind of social engineering for the classroom. And then, last study I'm going to talk about is with another graduate student, a doctoral student, Richard Davis, where we compared, 3 groups, 17 mechanical engineering students, and then 2 groups of high school students, one before a maker workshop and the second group after a maker workshop. So what we did with them is they were kind of assembling this kind of gearing. They did the workshop and all that, but the task was to assemble this gearing, this kind of differential mechanism, right? The kind of differential that you have in your car, or so. It was sort of a little replica of a gearing thing. And then we created a coding scheme for all the kind of micro actions that students were doing, like looking, exploring, organizing, rotating, and all of that. And so if you look at the video, so that's Richard over there. He's kind of, and then this is one of the students trying to assemble this thing, right? So then, the way it looks, that's how the coding scheme looks. So that's the action and the second. So you see, it's almost like every 2 or 3 seconds a different action. Anyways, when we did, then we did some clustering. Used a clustering algorithm. We took this sequence of actions and did some clustering, and we realized that there was a cluster that emerged with almost all the mechanical engineers and 3 of the post-workshop students, and the other cluster was the novices. So this clustering algorithms, the algorithm doesn't know who is a mechanical engineer, who is not, right? It's just based on the actions. So we're thinking, okay, there must be something about the actions that, is doing this. And so when we looked at the actual actions, we realized that there was, a lot of interesting differences. This is, I'll just go quickly on this, but because the last one is, I think, the most the most interesting difference, but this is like rotation, so people rotating, right? That's one of the actions. Meshing gears. So you see that the experts, they mesh gears like almost 10 times more than novices, right? They understand what gears are, that if the gears are not meshing, then something is wrong, but the novices don't know that. Mounting axles, also the experts, they understand, there's an axle, so there is stuff rotating around the axle and stuff like that. They do that much more. So what do novices do much more than experts? So they do a lot of trial and error. So that's, this big bar here. So trial and error is the kind of the marker of the novice, right? So they can, and I'll go back to that in a little bit, but sometimes you see people solving problems or building things, but they might not be actually like learning interesting engineering heuristics, because sometimes they're just doing trial and error. And it's not that by trial and error you're going to learn interesting engineering principles, right? So anyways, but what we found out is that the post-workshop high school kids, they did much less trial and error than the pre-workshop high school kids. So there is something about when you become an expert engineer, or when you're in that process, that you do less and less trial and error, and you become, that's why we call it affordance blind and affordance aware cluster, because you become more aware of the properties of the parts and the material. So you understand that a gear, it has to mesh with another gear. So you understand the affordances of gears. You understand the affordances of axles and all of that. And so that's one way that we're looking at expertise in engineering, is becoming aware of the affordances of the different things. And that makes you much more productive, and it makes you less of a trial and errorist kind of problem solver, and more like a focused problem solver. So those are some studies that we did on maker education. And I'm just mentioning all of that because I think there's lots of potential in doing those kinds of studies, and especially in a place where you have a lot of technical expertise like here, because you have technical expertise also in the sensors and the instrumentation of the maker spaces. So it's a great place to do experiments like this. So let me quickly talk about maker education in teaching. So lots of people talk about project-based learning as the next holy grail of education and all of that. A lot of times we talk about projects and how projects are amazing and how project-based, but not as often we talk about the learning, project-based learning. So there's always a project. We see the projects, but do we actually see the learning, right? Because as I said before, a lot of times you can get stuff done without learning much, because you can get stuff done by, Googling, by trial and error, by kind of guessing, by, all kinds of ways. And a lot of times we don't pay attention to the learning, project-based learning. So let me give you some examples of what the learning is and how it's important to pay attention to the learning, project-based learning. First of all, a lot of times when students are doing projects, there is a domain theory and expertise that is in addition to the technical expertise. So for example, if you're designing some kind of health device, right? There is the domain expertise in health or in whatever, right? Or if you're designing something for agriculture or for other areas, there's all the domain expertise in that area that's really important. And often in project-based learning, we kind of gloss over the domain expertise in these areas that are outside of kind of the core engineering knowledge. So sometimes, kids or students, they build some kind of health device that looks interesting and the engineering works, but it's a terrible for the health of the person. Or if it's an agriculture thing, but it doesn't follow any good principles of kind of good agriculture or things like that. So, that's one thing, that when students do projects, it's not just that the project works and looks cool. It has to be compatible, or it has to be in sync with, cutting edge theory in the domain. That's a missed opportunity for learning. The second thing is teachable moments. So the teachers that are working those maker spaces and the lab managers and all of that, they need to be trained for this, to understand teachable moments. So kids are doing, they're stuck in their projects you have to be trained to understand this is a perfect moment to teach about resistors, to teach about mechanical advantage, teach about some kind of new microcontroller that can solve the problem and all of that. And this is not, it doesn't come spontaneously. You have to be trained for that. The second thing, third thing is like project management. Like there's a lot of project management skill that, I mean, my students in my classes, we have to insist so much on this because people leave things for the last minute. They don't plan their projects and all of that. So in project-based learning, there's also a lot of learning about how to do projects, how to manage projects. There is the assessment, which is, you cannot assess those projects in the same way that you assess, with tests and all of that. So you have to have other kinds of assessment, and those assessments often should be done together with people that are experts in education and in assessment, because sometimes the engineering professors, they don't know exactly how to build, reliable and valid assessments for this kinds of complex projects. And finally, alignment with the learning goal. So let me show you examples of what I mean by that. So a lot of times people don't pay attention to this, but so to explain what this is, I'll talk about a class that I teach at Columbia and that now has versions at Stanford, Harvard, and also Northwestern, which is a project-based class that students have to design EdTech solutions. So they have to design, the class is called Beyond Bits and Atoms, and it's basically a class to design education technologies, so either software or hardware. So you can design like robotics toolkits, or you can design software for learning, math or physics or whatever. And so if you want more information about this class, I can send you some stuff later. But this is an example of a project-based class that kind of, going back to those principles that I talked before, those that there's a lot of concern about domain expertise, project management, assessment, and all of that. But the point here that I want to make is about microcontroller platforms, and that's the point about alignment with learning goals. So you all know Arduino, you all know the Lego platforms. You might know a little bit, which is another platform for kind of microcontroller stuff. And you might know Kubelets, which is yet another platform. So how do you decide which one to use if you're doing a project-based class with students in engineering or outside of engineering? So part of what I developed as part of that class, the Beyond Bits and Atoms class, is a sort of a theory about aligning the tools that you use and the learning goals that you have. So let me give you an example. If so the Cricut was the kind of what came before Lego. That's what I call Cricut model. So if you're interested in students learning about cybernetics and robotics, but you don't care about the input circuits and the microcontroller logic and the output circuits and all of that, you just want them connecting sensors to a box and then a box to motors and lights, right? Because you want them to understand robotics, not like how to solder resistors, how to do all that. Then you're going to use one kind of platform, which is, this kind of Lego, this kind of stuff. So you connect a sensor to a box, right? You're not soldering, you're not doing any of that stuff. But sometimes, the Arduino model is different. The black box is just a microcontroller, right? So here, if you want kids to understand about input circuits, output circuits, and all this stuff that's outside the dotted line, then you're going to use, Arduino, because as you know, Arduino, you have to, solder stuff, you need a breadboard, there's all that complication. If you don't want them to learn anything about, this kind of sensors and outputs and all of that, you just want them to kind of magnetically put blocks together and make a robot, then you're going to use something like Kubelets. So you don't even see wires. You just put these things together. They match magnetically, or like little bits, they also match magnetically. You don't even know what's going on, like in terms of sensors and all of that. So, anyways, the point here is that, most places I go, people just use Arduino like as a kind of one-size-fits-all solution for all kinds of problems. Or they just have the same electronics lab with like oscilloscopes and all kinds of, that kind of closet of electronics. But sometimes you don't really want students spending time learning about input circuits, output circuits, microcontrollers. You just want them to build stuff. And for that, you need to give them more kind of higher level toolkits. So things that are more like Lego, I mean, not necessarily Lego, but things that are more high level, and sometimes things that you have to develop internally. Because there's a lot of time that's spent, understanding this and building circuits and all of that, and sometimes you don't want that. So, I mean, the point is, in an engineering school, sometimes you want students doing AI stuff, right? Doing image recognition or all kinds of complicated stuff. So it's a great idea to develop modular toolkits that your students can use instead of making them spend hours and hours and days with the low-level stuff that's not part of your learning goal for a particular class, right? So that's the alignment with learning goal thing. Okay, and now, so let me just finish talking about maker education and design very quickly. So let me start by talking about the software environment that's for a CNC machine called Carve. So there is, I don't know if you have it in the US. There's a new kind of easy-to-use CNC machine in the US called Carve, and this is the software they have for Carve. So, it's nice. It is a web-based thing. It's sort of free with the machine, and then, but once you start using these more complicated bits, then you have to, click on this Pro button, and then it says, oh, Pro membership are $19.99, per month. So now you have to pay if you want to use the Pro features. So that's like I think the worst kind of education design in the world, right? So this is like, you're trying to eat healthy, and then something pops up and say, oh, if you want to eat healthy, you have to pay more because, and so if you want to learn more and go deeper and do something more interesting, you have to pay more. That's like a crazy incentive, right? I mean, learning more and, making something better should never be connected to like money and all of that. But why do they do this? Because they apply this kind of business models from, Silicon Valley freemium stuff to education, and that's like a really terrible idea. So, I mean, I'm putting this here because often companies that are in maker education trying to sell products, they just have the completely wrong model about how to, monetize and commercialize this stuff. And so this is, about design that universities and engineering schools, we can help often companies understand that this is exactly the wrong way to do things. Another problem of design is that if you look at the most famous kind of robotics platforms out of the Silicon Valley, look how much they cost. Like they have this beautiful plastic stuff, this colorful things, some have AI features and all of that. And, I mean, nothing wrong with having beautifully engineered solutions, but in many, many schools, this is just too much. So we also need to look at those kinds of solutions that are more expensive and more kind of engineered, but also those kinds of things that all, interestingly came from Europe, from universities or like, foundations in Europe. And so this is a really big contribution of engineering schools to the maker movement, is to create those kinds of toolkits. And instead of making them commercial products, make them open source platforms. So that's another area for impact for engineering schools. And, I think I'm not against having, commercial products. And I think even here at EPFL, there are many commercial products that came out of it. But I think it's really interesting to think about alternative ways to commercialize or to make technology available to people, right? So you design something, you make it open source, you give it to a foundation, and then people can buy or access it all over the world at a reasonable cost. There's no plastic around it and all of that. So I think that's a really interesting model that when I was in the Silicon Valley, people just don't understand this. They're like, oh, you're not making money on this. Yeah, but the point is not to make money. The point is to make something available to people, right? So if you look at people that have done this, so this is the LilyPad Arduino, which you might know. It's a platform that's also open source, was created at MIT and at University of Colorado and MIT, and it changed microcontroller design forever because it brought a lot of new materials and all of that. This is another kit that Leah Bickley, who created the LilyPad, created for people to create this kind of beautiful electronic sculptures, jewelry. Those are all things that are not really commercial, but are really interesting, and they include new populations in making. Paper pop-ups, again, it's not a product. It's just like a little microchip and a conductive ink pen. And so, just giving you examples of toolkits that are produced in engineering schools that can have, a big impact in schools and in the larger maker movement. And this is the Gogo board, which is something I created with my colleague Arnon Sipitakiat for robotics in developing countries. Topobo is a kind of kinetic sculpture kit that was created at MIT. So anyways, what I talked today was about first the origin story of maker education and gave you like the trends that are behind it. Then I talked about maker education and research. So there was a big opportunity to do studies on what your students are learning in those spaces. Maker education and teaching, and I made the point that it's not just about the project and project-based learning, it's also about the learning in project-based learning, and that requires training for teachers, for facilitators, for lab managers to understand, to recognize teachable moments, to design assessments, to redesign the pedagogy of the courses and all of that. That's sometimes not within the kind of expertise of engineering professors, and so great opportunities to partner with educational researchers, internally or externally. Many schools like MIT, for example, they have a few professors at MIT that are education PhDs, and they have their own labs, and they help, not only the engineering professors at MIT to redesign what they do, but they also use the engineering expertise at MIT to create, incredible products, just like Scratch, for example, which is, was created that way. So that's maker education and teaching. And finally, maker education and design. I think engineering schools can have a huge role in democratizing different kinds of technologies, building new kinds of toolkits and boards and platforms that can be made available, widely to people, to kids, to other students, just like the Arduino, the Raspberry Pi, Microbit, and all of that. And that can, go to millions and millions of people and have a big impact. So I think in the beginning, I talked about how maker education can change engineering, and I think it's a two-way street. There is maker education changing how we do teaching within engineering schools, but there is also engineering schools taking the lead in kind of moving this movement forward. Just think about the new technologies that we have today, like AI, advanced image recognition, DNA sequencing, all kinds of things that we could be thinking, what's the next, like, why not create the Arduino for, AI or for kind of advanced biology stuff? What kind of toolkits we can create that, will put in the hands of kids in 5 years, the stuff that's now cutting edge in your research labs, right? So it's a two-way street, and engineering schools can have a big impact internally and also, externally to these other people. So that's it. Thank you.
I'll start with asking, very nice talk, thank you. I was just wondering about the assessments that you were doing after to measure the learning impact of the study. So you were actually targeting the questions, like sort of like very related to the activity that they were doing, or more towards the curriculum when you were assessing the learning?
Yeah. So in some cases, the content is something you can assess in more traditional ways, like in a test or things like that. Sometimes it's something that you really need to create rubrics to look at the projects and see if people, are building projects using the knowledge that they're supposed to learn. So sometimes the project is a means to an end, so it's a means to learn about, biology or physics or something, and then you can do a test in physics or biology. But sometimes you want to know if the project itself is getting better. So then, the way I do it is we create rubrics, and then we communicate the rubrics to students, and we say we're going to look at, those aspects of the project, and we make sure that those rubrics are aligned with the learning goals of the class. So.
Thank you for your great talk. So you talked about the teachable moments, which was interesting for me. But generally about the importance of reflection in this kind of education. What's your perspective? Do you think it should be something that we saw within the teaching or in the product itself? What do you think?
Yeah, about reflection and.
Yes, about reflection. Do you think it's something that teachers should come to the students say, like motivate them to reflection, or it's something that we should design it into the tool itself?
Yeah. So I think, in one kind of intrinsic issue about maker education is that, as I said, it's possible to get something done, to build a project without learning much, right? Because there are lots of ways to make stuff work and not actually learning how it works, right? I mean, there are ways to kind of improvise or kind of, do kind of like makeshift solutions that might make things work for like half an hour, but the thing will fall apart, after a half hour. So I think sometimes, it's important. One issue in when students are building projects is that sometimes the projects are themselves so kind of cool and interesting that you lose track of the process, right? So, and the project might kind of obfuscate the fact that maybe students were not doing the project in a way that led to the optimum amount of learning, right? So I think it's teachers or professors, they have to pay attention to the process of how students, so having milestones in projects, So what I do in my classes is that they have to, in the first week or whatever, week 5, they have to come up with like a technical milestone. So they have to give me the technical plans, what they're going to accomplish technically. Then the next week they have to design a low resolution prototype. The other week they have to bring a higher resolution prototype and all of that. So there's lots of moments for reflection and for course correction, and also for me or for the teacher to suggest best practices, right? So if I know that they're designing a prototype that, like, I can say, okay, you're designing a user interface. So here is a paper about user interface design. So, read this and make sure you don't have weird buttons all over in place. Or if they're designing something about like underwater robotics, you say, okay, read this paper about how to waterproof things or how to propel. So if you plan the process and you have these intermediate milestones, and then you make sure that for each of those milestones you know the learning goal and you know what engineering or concept they want to learn, then you can use those as teachable moments and say, okay, this week we're going to focus on this 2 or 3 topics, and make sure when you bring your plan and when you implement the plan, you're using that stuff. And you're not just kind of improvising and all of that. I mean, of course, that doesn't mean that sometimes improvisation is good, and it's kind of fun, and it's also an engineering skill, right? But you don't want students just doing that all the time, right? Yes.
You talked about developing tools for developing countries. Can you say more about that?
Yeah.
You have the slide, and you said that's for.
Yeah. So.
What, I mean, 2 points. What is the difference?
So.
Why do you use different tools there than you would in other places of the world?
Yeah. So, for example, this board, we were working in Thailand and Brazil, and we realized that the import taxes were so high that to import, a robotics box into Thailand or Brazil, it kind of doubles the price. So what we did was to design a board that was built with locally found components. So all the components in that board, if you go to Thailand, you can find them in like the electronics street or whatever. So people can assemble them locally, right? And as you can see, there's no like plastic there, or so we kind of stripped it down to the bare minimum, and also we make it, all the soldering is through hole, so there's no surface mount components and all of that. So in this case, we adapted it to a particular condition to make it. So that was the the example of that. Yes.
You talked about the importance of training the lab managers and the lab assistants involved in this kind of work.
Yeah.
Could I get a sense from you in terms of how much training, what kind of training, how that should be best structured? I mean, given that the people involved are not teachers, they're not going to be, they're not looking for teaching certificate.
Right.
They're not required to have a teaching certificate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. I think often teaching certificates also don't really teach the stuff that they need to, the kind of teaching that they would do in the lab. Yeah. So I think, sometimes this training is more like an apprenticeship with me, in my lab. So, but one part of it is about the kind of noticing the expert blind spot, right? So, I've had some really bad TAs, over the years, and they just couldn't see this expert blind spot thing. They say, this is so easy. Like, they were telling my students, why can't you do this? This is easy. Like, just do the what. So I think one thing is to notice that if you're like a advanced engineering student, you might know a lot of stuff that, a first year might not have any idea about, right? And it's very disempowering and kind of, really hard for a first-year student to be like feeling like, oh, this is so easy, I can't do it, right? So it's exactly the kind of thing you don't want to do. So there is that part of the expert blind spot, becoming aware of it. There is also a lot of like empathy kind of training, making them remember how it feels not to know something, and being helpless and being because there is a little bit of kind of toxic masculinity in engineering schools, unfortunately. So there is this kind of macho culture of, I'll do things myself, and if you can't do it, you're like weak and you can't do anything, and people, and especially when you want to kind of bring more female students, into the fold and into the maker spaces. It's important to have a culture that's more inclusive, and more like not like this kind of kind of hacker culture that you have to kind of spend all night in the lab, and there is a lot of kind of this competitiveness of who knows more and all of that. So I mean, you have to kind of detoxify some of the. But the expert blind spot, empathy, remember what it feels like not to know things, and also if you, I mean, there are some engineering practices that are great if you're going to industry, right? So if you're going to go to like advanced mechanical or electronic engineering, great practices for like having less error, right? Or like cleaning up your station so that it's pristine every time. That in a makerspace, it's not really, I mean, my lab, I don't like it to be very clean because it's kind of, it's a bit like dead, if you go to a lab and there's nothing, everything is absolutely clean and perfect, it's kind of, I don't like it very, so there's something that, it works for industry if you're like in a professional environment, engineering, but in a makerspace, you have to have more flexibility, right? I think so that's part of the teaching.
You're talking a lot about expertise, and you have within the school, like EPFL, many different professors being experienced on teaching with different models and so on. How would you recommend us to build a community of practice? Because I have the feeling that we are reinventing the wheel sometimes, and we are sometimes addicted to. What is your expertise on the way you could actually, in the best possible way, share best practices among different people following the same rules?
Right.
And developing those best practices that are common to the projects.
Yeah, I think, one thing, today I was visiting many labs, and I think, I also went to engineering school, and there are like engineering labs or teaching labs that they sort of need to be, clean and kind of organized because there are lots of students coming and going, and, you can't just have a big mess in there, right? So I think those spaces, they are, they're fine as they are, and you need to be organized about running them. But you might want to have, this different kinds of spaces that are more like the maker space, or, I also visited some spaces like that have more of, they have more character, and they are the physical space where the community of practice comes together to, right? So there is a culture building thing. So, maybe you have tons of projects like on the walls. You have projects that didn't work, so that people can inspect them. You have maybe some personal stuff on the walls, or, it doesn't have to be a huge mess, but you could make, the physical space be part of the culture of this. And then people come to the space to build a community of practice. But, that sometimes in engineering schools, it requires a little bit of engineers kind of letting go of the kind of, the traditional way to manage those spaces. Because, the space and the culture, they are very intertwined, right? We know that from research, right? That, you go to a space and there are lots of hidden messages everywhere, right? This hidden curriculum of... so I think creating spaces that are managed with more creativity and with more kind of flexibility, I think is great. I've heard that you're going to build a big space here, right? So, making it have character and making the students feel at home there instead of like a factory-like place that's, kind of very impersonal, and even if it might violate the kind of Swiss standards for perfection and
A clean mess.
a clean mess. Yeah.